Hello guys, my name is Anna and not only I vlog daily from Ukraine, but I'm also happy to invite extremely important voices that support Ukraine on the channel for important conversations. And today we not just have a guest, but indeed a friend of mine, a friend of the channel and a friend of Ukraine. The author of the Silicon Curtain YouTube channel, and I greatly advise you to subscribe if you haven't yet, Jonathan Fink. Welcome to the channel.
It's so exciting, Anna. Thank you so much. I'm honored to be on your channel.
Well, I had a little bit different introduction, but today both of us are wearing vyshyvankas, and I know that Jonathan has bought his in Ukraine.
You know that for a good reason. Yes, you helped me to
Can you
choose it.
share the story? Can you share the story of your
Yes,
vyshyvanka?
absolutely. Well, we didn't have a huge amount of time. We filmed in the center of town. We made a fantastic video for your channel last year.
In Lviv.
In Lviv, air raid siren went off. We had to sort of pause our setup a little bit, but in Lviv, everyone carries on doing everything anyway through the air raid sirens. So we recorded a fantastic segment, and then we think we had about sort of 20 minutes only before you had to run off and do some more shooting. We managed to find a vyshyvanka shop. We found this beautiful one here. This is the first in what I hope is to be a vyshyvanka collection. So another reason why I have to visit, I have to get the next outfit in the collection. I got one for my son, which is absolutely beautiful one with a little red embroidery. He's worn it to a couple of Ukrainian events already since then. But no, it's something. I mean, firstly, they're beautiful, but secondly, I think it's a symbol of solidarity. It's not cultural appropriation. I'm not pretending to be Ukrainian. I think it's a strong symbol of support.
Well, as a Ukrainian, I can tell you that we personally consider you a bit Ukrainian because of all the support that you're doing. And once again, using this opportunity, I want to thank people of the United Kingdom who stand with Ukraine without a doubt.
Now, I was accused recently. There's an interesting gentleman who comes over quite a lot from Ukraine. He has a lot of contacts here with British politicians and so on. And yeah, he jokingly accused me of being a Lvov nationalist. So,
Well, then the only solution to this accusation is to visit Ukraine and start getting collections of different regions. You can begin with Volyn. I come from Volyn, and I can share some patterns of vyshyvanka later. But let's start our conversation. And it was such a pleasure to think about the questions that I want to ask you, because not only you know a lot about Ukraine, Russia, and this part of the world, but also you communicate with a great number of very important intellectual people, experts in different fields who share their opinions with you. And my very first question will be maybe for those who do not follow our channels that like attentively and still do not know some things about our background. Jonathan, recently I had to look through A War and Peace of Tolstoy for a documentary about Russian propaganda in literature. And once again, I have proven to myself the thesis of Eva Thompson, who says that in War and Peace, there is just like huge Russia, and at the end of Russia, Germany starts. So all the peoples between Russia and Germany, they do not exist at all. No Poland, no Ukraine, no anything else. And still for many, Ukraine, lots of other Central Eastern European countries remained terra incognita, something unknown, different parts of Russian Empire, and there existed lots of stereotypes. And I know that you follow the updates from Ukraine and from Russia for a really long period of time. Oh, where did you get this interest to our part of the world? And when I say our, I don't really want to share it with Russia, but I mean this terra incognita that was hidden behind the Iron Curtain.
Oh, that's we could probably spend a couple of hours on that one, but I'll try to keep it short. Let's start with the idea of Russia having no borders. This is an incredibly. This isn't just something Putin. It's the same. They're all part of the same matryoshka doll construct of autocrats. This isn't a new idea. If you read a book by Andrei Biely, Peterburg, which is a novel from the golden age of Russian literature, he describes St. Petersburg as a kind of geometric abstract, a hierarchy of the bureaucracy of almost infinite power and ambition. And he also says you've got the three roads that launch out from the Admiralty Building, the Admiralty Spire, which is the center point, both geometrically and geographically, and indeed historically, for St. Petersburg. And they radiate out. And he describes them going into infinity. They have no end. So this idea that Russia has no borders, and not just Russia, the imperial hierarchy, the imperial autocracy, the administration and bureaucracy, because again, St. Petersburg, which really was created as part of this great imperial project. It's very much a bureaucratic hierarchy as well as an imperial and Russian cultural one. All these things are completely interlinked, and the word that the Russians have for Germany is Nemцы, which essentially means dumb people, people who are incomprehensible, people who speak a language which is, impenetrable, is nonsense. And in fact, now they, apply that to Germany. That word was generally applied to anybody who didn't speak Russian. So you've got Russia and you've got everything else. And if you want to take it to the extreme, the dumb people, the mute people, and Russia, the exceptional people, Third Rome, the inheritance of civilization and empire, and all that kind of stuff. And when we look at these and say, well, they really can't believe this. But unfortunately, that's not just something that Dugin and others who have taken the, I would say, fascistic rhetoric, fascistic ideas, very much from the white emigre forces that fled Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution. It's not just a few sort of philosophers that have imbibed these ideas of exceptionalism. They're extremely common amongst Russians as well. And that includes, the liberal elite. Well, I've launched too soon onto politics. You wanted to ask about my background. Why am I interested in all this stuff? I started sort of reading Russian literature in English from about 14 onwards, from the age of about 14, 15 as well, from 15 started studying Russian history and carried that all the way through to university. So my degree was in Russian language, literature, history. I actually spent a considerable amount of time in Mordor throughout the 90s, about 3 years on and off, living, traveling, studying, and then working. And that was deeply instructive. And I wasn't one of those Russophiles. I mean, you could put a label Russophile because I was fascinated by the place, but not someone who I think approached it with rose-tinted spectacles. Because coming to the point of history, I also, you're going to really hate this, Anna. My son is called Theodore, which translates to Fyodor, and you know who that's named after. But Dostoevsky is a deeply fascinating writer because it is the first emergence of critical thinking around Orthodox religion, which is it's not part of really the Russian culture. Orthodoxy is the only faith in the territory of Russia. It's an extremely hierarchical system, and therefore it doesn't have the culture of debate and negotiation and different faiths having to live side by side. It's a monocracy. It's a single idea. One could almost say a theocracy as well. Dostoevsky is a deeply psychologically troubled person, deeply messed up. And anyone who reads it and says, oh, isn't it wonderful? Isn't it beautiful? No, I mean, he writes about deeply troubling things, and he himself is a deeply disturbed person. But it's the first emergence, I think, of a sort of philosophical debate or questioning, creating a dialogue within society about some of the fundamental values and structures about religion. That dialogue is constantly suppressed by the authorities. And indeed, in 1917, any concept of dialogue or debate is completely snuffed out and destroyed by the Bolsheviks. And I think that kind of continues to this day. So I think there's a deep fascination I've had about Russia, which is a country that tries to mimic Europe in terms of technology, in terms of, the luxuries of life, and especially in terms of trying to mimic the imperial power and status that Europe has. But the ambitions don't match the means. And Russia continuously copies the superficial material aspects of Western civilization and indeed calls itself European, but never tries to copy or even understand the mechanisms and processes that created the material and technological culture of Europe. There's no attempt. There's even very little attempt, I think, amongst the Russian so-called opposition to fundamentally look at what goes into creating the power and material wealth of European civilization. Now, this is where I think Ukraine differs. Ukraine, through Maidan and through multiple revolutions and through its deep historical roots with European culture, is trying to create the mechanisms of political culture that give rise to power and wealth. And I think Ukraine has realized that it needs to align itself with Europe and European values in order to do that. And in some sense, in certain areas like countering, informational warfare, I think Ukraine is going beyond what Europe is currently capable of. So I think this is a fundamentally interesting area, and it's a deep, deep clash of civilizational values.
Thank you. It is indeed a very beautiful description of all the complex histories that stand behind our very different ways of Ukraine and of Russia. And as you've touched upon the subject of literature that fascinated you, I will also continue by sharing that one of my favorite authors, Olga Tokarczuk, who is Nobel Prize winner, and by the way, in her texts, if some of my viewers or your viewers love reading her, she writes about my native city, Lutsk, which is also close to the border with Poland. And in her award speech, she mentioned a very interesting concept of a tender narrator, a person who can describe everything with detail, emotion, and feeling. And I do have this impression that you are a very tender observer and a tender translator of various new tendencies, moods appearing even before they actually become vivid to the general public. That's why my next questions from this your tender observer perspective. What changes in Russian propaganda, in Russian, I cannot say diplomacy, but I mean this like fake diplomacy and maybe even military strategy you observe in the recent months?
So this is an interesting one. And I have to say, my sources for many of our ideas come from that deep experience of Russia in the 90s and drawing upon, literature experience or private conversations as well. Just recalling the kind of dialogues I had with people in taxis, in the street, in trams, in trains, that kind of stuff. I think that's an important direct source of where a lot of these ideas come from. And if we compare that to, say, sort of realist political thinkers who have none of the local context, who don't necessarily even speak Russian and have not spent an extended time there, I think anyone who does not have that and yet pronounces upon what Russians think and what they're likely to do, I unfortunately have zero respect for people who come from the abstract and top down and political theorizing rather than the bottom up, which is direct experience. So that's one thing. The other thing is, part of it is that I listen to at least 3 or 4 hours a day of materials in Russian language. So often this would be people like Honcharенko and many other commentators who are essentially Ukrainian but broadcasting in Russian. This gives the lie to Russian propaganda. There is huge media output in Ukraine, deep, very specialist and interesting analysis and commentary in Russian produced by Ukrainians. So that for me is a very rich source of information. And there are a handful, very, very few, but there are a handful of commentators who I think are quite interesting on what is going on the Russian side. Vladimir Milov is one, Michael Naki. They produced extremely concentrated information, and they have deep contact still inside Russia and to an extent the administration. And their speculations, I think, are interesting because they have a long perspective on how their system works and the Russian mindset. And often that's far more useful than many Western commentators who are maybe at second or third hand trying to interpret what's going on. The changes in propaganda. Well, first of all, I think this week is a crucial week to talk about it because you have an absolute frenzy of wailing amongst the propagandists because they thought Speaker Mike Johnson was one of them. They thought their propaganda had completely zombified and taken over the Republican Party and the evangelical wing there. And they also, I think, thought that Trump is transcendent and about to become president again. Well, some interesting things have happened. Speaker Mike Johnson seems to have had a complete change of heart. He's gone from really being I wouldn't dare say direct supporter of the Kremlin, but he's been extremely favorable to the Kremlin over the last 6 months in causing aid to be delayed. And the whole tone of his narrative has been quite problematic. He's now suddenly come out and he's saying extraordinary, I would say, things that are aligned with Ukrainian victory. You've got Mitch McConnell, the outgoing leader of the House, I'm going to use my terminology wrong, a significant person, influential person within the Republican Party. He's coming out and saying things that are actually far more aligned to a Ukrainian victory, even than we're hearing from the Biden administration. But the whole positioning of the debate has gone from escalation management, fearing Russian nuclear threats, and a lot of the Russian propaganda, to your point, has been around, don't mess with us, don't cross these red lines because you wouldn't like it, we're capable of anything, we're slightly mad, you've got to fear us, and, nuclear Armageddon will result. So it's been in the interest of Russian propagandists to make us believe they are eternal, infinite, unbeatable, and also slightly crazy and could turn the world to ashes. None of these things, I think, are true, but that's definite thrust of the propaganda. It now seems that one by one, with Britain really, from the start of the war, France from the start of it really dates back to December, but really the start of this year, Macron has started to not play Russia's game. You threaten us with nuclear weapons. Well, we have them too, he said. So we're hearing a far harder line, pushing back against the bullying tactics. And this week, you're hearing an extraordinary change in the debate from many Republicans, the core of that party. And you're starting to hear even Jake Sullivan, his language has firmed up a little bit. And of course, we now find out that ATACMS were delivered even at the same time as the US was publicly saying that Ukraine shouldn't hit Russian oil infrastructure. Privately, they perhaps don't have the same concerns and were already delivering long-range ATACMS even prior to the bill. So I think we're moving towards an intolerance for Russian propaganda and Russian threats, and gradually, far too late, but gradually we're seeing an alignment amongst Western allies that actually Ukrainian victory is not only desirable, but is absolutely essential for our own peace and security in Europe.
That would be a very important change in this general strategy that for 2 years was quite vague. Like, we don't want Russia to win, we don't want Ukraine to lose, but now we see that Do you think actually that all of these sides that were in doubt, like Mike Johnson, for example, or some of the EU leaders who were quite neutral until now when they started actively support Ukraine, this change was caused by some internal access to some internal information, something that influenced them personally from the Ukrainian side, or they got tired of this Russian BS propaganda and constant threats that will also sooner or later stop working. You cannot, as a Ukrainian, I know you cannot constantly live in anxiety, in fear. You get tired of that. So what is more important on these scales?
I think we don't know, but I think it's absolutely fascinating to speculate. And I think history will show that some really interesting things have happened over the last few weeks behind the scenes. First of all, Republicans wouldn't change their public stance unless they saw some electoral advantage or some electoral threat. So I think there are several things going on. I think, firstly, they've started to realize that their stance on Ukraine is not that popular and is not really an electoral advantage. They have a hard core of voters who have been either brainwashed into believing Ukrainians are Nazis, or they are simply, more on the isolationist view of the US. So I don't want to label everybody as being brainwashed. I don't want to label everybody as being Kremlin assets. Some people genuinely hold libertarian views and they believe America should withdraw from the world. But I think there's been an understanding that actually they risk losing the election if they stick to blocking Ukraine aid. So first of all, there's electoral advantage. Now, if they thought Ukraine was going to be defeated, they wouldn't make that switch because, let's be cynical about this, no politician wants to be associated with failure. So there may also be a shift in understanding that actually Russia is potentially weaker than it seems, and that Ukrainian victory is actually a possibility. And of course, politicians are going to pile in when they think victory is a possibility. My view is that actually Ukrainian strikes against Russian oil facilities show that Ukraine have the will and potentially the means to win. So whereas publicly this is condemned or Ukraine is gently chided or told off by the Biden administration, I think this move against Russian oil industry has shown the world that Ukraine can win and it can really hurt Russia in ways that damage its war machine. So that's an extraordinarily important strategy. If anybody influential is watching this, please carry on that strategy. It is so important to show that you can stand up to the bully and to show that Ukraine can innovate and win and has the will to win. And it gets out of that idea that Ukrainians are victims, etc. It turns Ukraine into something that, which in its own right is a great power, the second most powerful military entity in Europe, which undoubtedly now is. But I think there are other things. Again, this is incredibly important, I think, for Ukrainians. There has been an effort to reach out to Mike Johnson, who is genuinely a very religious person. And I'm not going to sort of mock that. But that's not my world. It's not what I believe in. And I think many Ukrainians are secular, so this may not be a natural strategy for many people, but actually Russia has been repressing, torturing, tormenting Baptists and Christians of various denominations, all denominations except Russian Orthodox under the Moscow Patriarch. Everybody else is persecuted. That message has been ignored or repressed. I think it's starting to get through. American evangelicals are just starting to realize that Ukraine is not, Russia is not their friend and is not supportive of religious plurality and is especially harsh against what it sees as US agents, anyone from the Protestant denominations. I think it's incredibly important for Ukrainians to not just reach out to a secular audience, but to actually tell these important religious stories, because there are people of conviction in the US. And that's maybe the only thing that is going to counter Russian propaganda, is these real and terrible stories of persecution. So all this is kind of going on. Now, if the Democrats have started to realize that Ukrainian victory is one of the routes for them to succeed in the election. It seems that Ukrainians, sorry, I'm going to get all my terms confused, Republicans are also realizing that. What I'm hoping is you're now going to get a kind of arms race to see who can outdo each other in enabling Ukrainian victory, because they don't want to be left behind. I'm hoping we'll see that in Europe as well, as Britain has just announced that it's increasing military spend. France hopefully will be embarrassed into providing, more stuff, and eventually the Germans will either ditch their I'm going to put a label on it, their appeasing president. Now, Germany's provided huge amounts of munitions in terms of volume, and it's the second largest supplier of military aid to Ukraine, if we count it on a unilateral basis. But blocking Taurus is a serious problem. Delaying delivery of F-16s is a serious problem. Not ramping up the production lines for Leopards and all this kind of stuff, and delaying supply of ammunition. All these are serious problems which should and could have been overcome by a different leader. So, but hopefully, that was a very long answer, Anna, but hopefully we're now going to see some progress on all of this.
This is a very meaningful answer, and you're very correct in these two important moments. Number one, that we can change a lot. I mean, people of the world who address their politicians, and despite their plans, despite their visions, we are able to persuade them no. And the people of the United States did that by writing emails, making telephone calls, that even from this very practical election perspective, they've realized it's more important to protect Ukraine and democracy worldwide than to play with Russian messages. And also that in times of despair, when it seems like everyone abandoned you, it's important to continue fighting back. And our strategy with oil refineries maybe demonstrated this resilience, and once again that we are not going to give up. This is indeed a very important message that was quite difficult for Ukrainians to predict, that Russian propaganda may use it, because generally Ukraine is a very Christian and very religious country in comparison to the majority of European countries. Like Sunday services are very widespread among families, visit them, holidays, keeping Lent and all of that. And there are lots of Protestant movements who are strong here, who have large communities, who do a lot actually to support Ukrainian armed forces, but who already suffered a lot from Russian shellings. And I've also seen Mike Johnson meeting a husband who is a Protestant, and he lost half of his family, a wife and a newly born child, in one of Russia's missile attacks. And I also have friends from this confession who say that their Russian counterparts are suffering greatly, and they are suffering for decades in Russia because they are persecuted, and they don't have normal rights and freedoms to practice their religion. And indeed, once again, we were not prepared for this Russian campaign like Ukraine is closing churches and so on, when it's only about Russian Orthodox Church that is now used as a propaganda tool and actually does a lot of evil. So thank you for stressing that. And I do hope, Jonathan, that in the weeks, months to come, we will witness this competition on the aid to Ukraine. That would be great.
Yeah. Well, the next one on that, Anna, is boots on the ground, because one of the first episodes on my channel actually asked that question. Should we close the skies above Ukraine? Should we protect Ukraine's sovereign territory that is not occupied? And should we put boots on the ground? Well, there was absolute sort of, tumbleweed to that, even amongst hawkish experts who I was asking 2 years ago whether we should be doing this. The idea was unthinkable. The idea that Ukraine could send its proxy forces through the Russian legions onto Russian territory, capture, villages, towns, and disrupt, logistics. Absolutely unthinkable. The idea that Ukraine should be hitting Russian territory to take missile and drone launch sites out at source, unthinkable 2 years ago. A lot has changed, and I think we're going to see over the next year the idea around boots on the ground changing as well.
You've said, and I totally agree with this, that politicians are very pragmatic. And the fact that both American Democrats and Republicans now demonstrate their belief that Ukraine can win proves that they see Russia as weak. We do. But I mean, more and more people around the world realize that this fake image of Russia as a great power was overestimated. And my next question will be, from your perspective, how do you think, what is the greatest threat to Kremlin regime right now, in this moment in history?
Well, Russia is always, let's say, stronger and weaker at the same time than we suspect. And we've seen Western media and even some analysts swing wildly between over and underestimating Russian strength. One of the reasons, and there are several reasons, one of the reasons why the summer offensive last year didn't work is because we underestimated the ability of Russia to put up defensive fortifications, build the minefields and so on. And now we overestimate the strength of Putin. What's been really interesting over the last week is to see a number of propagandists, including Solovyov, hinting that Putin is weak, hinting that his measures are indecisive and that he needs to do far more in order to secure a Russian victory. Now, anyone who understands the Russian psyche will understand that it's a vertical of power. The one thing you cannot be when you're at the top of that pile is weak. One of the things you should never do is pull your punches and be indecisive and fail. Hopefully might get you demonetized. You've got to be the biggest bastard in the room. You absolutely have to be, because there are 1,000 other people lined up who are ready and willing to show that they are more, жестоки. They are tougher, stronger, nastier than the guy in charge. That's the only way you can stay on top of that system. And so for Putin to show hesitancy, weakness, and so on, I think is important. That might be one of the reasons why this week we see the second in command in the Ministry of Defense, Shoigu's deputy, being arrested and very swiftly put on trial. Now, we have to understand that within the Russian system, this isn't a corruption case. Everybody is corrupt. It's a systemic corruption. Everyone knows how it works. Everyone knows how much money everybody else is skimming out of the system. If you're in that system, you understand that. So if they choose to prosecute someone, it is 100% political. Now, it has been speculated that what we're seeing is the start of a process whereby the FSB, or the security structures, who essentially had taken over most of the country in the 90s and beyond, replacing all institutions and infiltrating any independent organic group, including the media, and essentially like some kind of knotweed or cancer, taking everything over. Well, the military was one of the last places that was not controlled by the FSB, that has some degree of autonomy, some degree of identity, culture, and status, that is not totally infected by the security service. Well, what we could well be seeing now is a move by the FSB or GIO, or whatever you want to call it, to take over every single aspect of society, including the military itself. This, I think, will lead to purges, it will lead to conflict, and it will lead to more incompetence, because I don't think they're necessarily going to make the right decisions and put the right sort of talented people in charge. So that, I think, is a sort of fascinating process that's taking place. The other thing, which I think you're going to sort of celebrate, and I was talking about this to somebody who has some connection still to the Russian economy in terms of his information, he says there's an interesting process taking place. Now, you'll probably be aware of how Bill Browder lost his business. And that is essentially, some oligarch type people look at this rich business. They get approval from the Kremlin to do this, and then they basically bribe some bureaucrats to sign the business over to them so they control it. So this isn't a sort of takeover that happens in the Western legal sense. It's literally you forge the ownership documents for a company, and you basically steal it from its owners, and then you make them illegal when they try to take back their own business. You get them killed or thrown into jail. Well, the rumor here is that at the start of the war, Russia started confiscating Western assets, and that process is going to follow through until they're all gone. And there's no question there. Putin needs Western assets that are still based in Russia to give to his loyal deputies, Z patriots, and this kind of stuff to keep his system going. The next thing they started doing is stealing the assets of Russians who fled the country. And there's now a law in place that all their possessions can be appropriated by the state. Well, what is happening now is that oligarchs are being asked to bring their family and their money back to Russia, and they will be okay, it says, within the system. But if you don't agree to repatriate your family and wealth, you'll have it taken by other oligarchs. That process is underway as well. But it gets worse. There are people who've built businesses from scratch in Russia. There are people who are talented at business. There are people who've taken old Soviet businesses, revived them into going concerns to generate wealth. What's happening now is that Z patriots, thugs, corrupt officials are starting to eye those businesses, the remaining profitable businesses in Russia, and they are starting a process where they will bribe some officials. The officials sign those businesses over to them. They then asset strip those businesses, and you can imagine, they get rich quick, get their money out of the country, but in the process they've destroyed the business. So what we're now seeing, I think, is the Russian society fighting like rats in a sack, and the last vestiges of, I would call it sort of any kind of productive, innovative business environment is going to be cannibalized and destroyed as Russia consumes itself.
I love your choice of epithets and comparisons, indeed. And that's actually a very typical Russian business strategy that was born somewhere back in the 90s, but now it grew more criminal, more violent, and potentially will lead to the collapse. A very complicated question from a Ukrainian perspective, because taking into account this war, this brutal invasion, I cannot be objective. And you might have noticed I do not invite Russians to my channel, even those who speak for Ukraine. But I do hear many global leaders inspiring Ukrainians to look for good Russians. Ukrainian joke about what Russians are good. But I do understand that ocean will not appear on the territory of Russian Federation. And from your perspective, that allows some degree of neutrality. Where would you advise Ukrainians to look for good Russians in case of need? I mean, after the collapse of Kremlin's regime, liberation of all territories, and the moment when we have to start to de-zombify Russian population. So where do we find them? How do we test them?
So it's not, I don't have the right to tell any Ukrainian what they should do and who they should speak to, and what their concept of victory should be, and what kind of relationship they should have with Russia after the war. I have no right to tell anyone that. I have no right to insist that Ukrainians should sit down with Russians at this point. In fact, I strongly support the point of view that Ukrainians shouldn't have to do that. They shouldn't be asked to do that. They shouldn't be coerced to do that. And I'm entirely supportive of Ukrainian writers and anybody else who refuses to share a platform with any Russian, no matter their point of view. It should be a matter, I think, of individual choice. Now, I do know of many Ukrainians who are working with Russians to raise money for the armed forces of Ukraine. Again, that is a personal choice, and typically they don't advertise it as a Ukrainian working with a Russian. They don't mention at all. They just say, we're doing this, this is the cause, and, take action, take part. So I think it's highly inappropriate for any media to seek to create this sort of illusory idea of Russians and Ukrainians, some having a rapprochement. There are Russians who are even calling themselves Ukrainian and are very much aligning with the Ukrainian cause. And I think that's fantastic. I think it's the mark of whether, and I don't use good Russian or bad Russian, but if a Russian, and I know a few who were born in the USSR, born in on Russian territory, but who have deep connections with Ukrainian. I even know some people who are born in Russia, but have lived and worked in Ukraine and speak fluent Ukrainian. I don't think it's right to put labels on them if they are working to raise money for the armed forces of Ukraine. And if they understand that Russian decolonization, how important that is, and if they understand the mechanics of Russian imperialism and sort of cultural hegemony and that kind of stuff, then I think, it's up to people as individuals if they want to work with them and talk with them and communicate with them and collaborate. But I think it's completely wrong to create any kind of public forum which seeks to say, oh, look, Ukrainians and Russians together. I think it's entirely wrong and shouldn't be encouraged. After the war, I actually don't think it's up to Ukrainians to transform Russia in any way. I don't think you can or even should try to impose your version of democracy onto Russia, because I don't think it would work. And this is a message for the US as well. If Russia is going to democratize, it has to come from Russians themselves. Now, you and I know how problematic that is, and that's why we're not particularly optimistic about it. But if democracy is going to take root in Russia, it's going to be a generational process, and it has to come from Russians themselves. My personal view is that the entire vertical structure of Russian administration and the way the entire federation is set up would need to change. The ownership of their hydrocarbon industries would need to change. All of the ownership of extraction industries would need to be probably nationalized, and that wealth divided up equally amongst the population if there's to be any change whatsoever. And Russia would need to do what Ukraine did after Maidan, which is radical decentralization of power down to cities, villages, regional areas. Now, this all sounds wonderful, but it is simply not going to happen if Russia remains an imperial entity. So I don't think it's up to Ukrainians to expend their time and energy trying to reform Russia or tell Russians what to do. I think you need to build a bloody big wall between you and Russia. If Belarus is on the European side, that's even better. I think in the next couple of years, we will see Belarus, the similar kind of process happening where Belarus collapses and comes over to the West. And then we have a nice clean line and we build a huge wall, and Ukraine gets lots of military factories and missiles and drones and tons of tanks. And that becomes a hard border between freedom and barbarism. And that, unfortunately, I think is what awaits us.
You are right. When you say democratic Russia or democracy in Russia, I feel it's a euphemism, something that cannot come together, unfortunately. And I share more optimism for Belarus, and this is a kind of responsibility that we can take on. Believe me, no one in Ukraine actually wants to interfere in Russian affairs. The only thing we want is to liberate our territories and, of course, perhaps to build up our military potential, because we're such a neighbor. Once again, I believe democracy is impossible in the countries of such great size.
It made me think of an example, Anna, there. There's Alexander Matviechuk, the Nobel Prize winner.
Mhm.
Now, she actively works with counterparts in Belarus and actively agitates for the liberation or freedom of human rights people in Belarus, which I think is interesting. She also is very vocal about supporting the founder of Memorial in Russia, who has now been arrested and is living in fairly awful conditions, one imagines, and you have to fear as to whether he will get out of prison. And I've also heard positive things said about Karamurza, which I think is appropriate. But I think that's up to an individual choice, and I think, as you say, there is far more perspective in working with Belarusians, because they are also a colonized people as opposed to being the colonizer. And I think that's probably much easier.
Invaded by the horde. I prefer this terminology. One of the reasons why many countries now demonstrate more confidence in the support of Ukraine, since very recently, might be this understanding that Russian war in Ukraine is not a local conflict. And Russia threatening the world, threatening to reconstruct Soviet Union, and we all know it is likely. Maybe not this autumn, but in 2 years, 5 years, if the situation remains, for example, as it is now. And if you had to describe how our world has changed, let's say since 2020, what are these greatest changes that have become visible and we have to accept them as our new normal, or not accept them, but how do you say that? Like, they exist. We have to to agree that now the world is like that.
Well, I mean, the biggest change has to be in viewing Russia as an endless source of wealth, money, and as viewing Russia as in the German point of view, which is by maximizing your economic trade, somehow you're going to help in the democratization. The country with which you do trade and depends on your money is not going to turn around and bite the hand that feeds it. Well, that strategy has demonstrably shown to fail. It's an utter and catastrophic failure. It is unfortunate that no one in Germany is yet taking responsibility for that, and no one's carried the can for that. And people like Gerhard Schroeder should be in a court of law, not being given sort of birthday parties by colleagues from his party. But I think generally there's an understanding now that Russian money is not. It doesn't come free. It comes with a price, and that price is the corruption of your political system and the degradation of your values. And then they'll turn around anyway and punch you in the face and then blame you for doing that. So classic Russian technique. The West has been trying to destroy us, blah, blah, blah. Whereas what the West has actually done is given Russia the money to embark on its imperial aggression. So that's a fundamental change. The slower change is what you then do about it. And the West has been catastrophically slow at realizing that Russia is attacking us and that we need to rebuild not just our military capabilities, but also look at the idea of resilience, informational resilience, cyber resilience, social resilience, and also question our own institutions. Our own democratic institutions of culture have become extremely weak, I would say, compared to where they were in the immediate post-war period or even during the Cold War.
Thank you. Very powerful messages that I fully support. And perhaps the final and the most important question of this interview that many of our friends, viewers, expect. When are you coming back to Ukraine?
That is a great question, and it's definitely this year. Now, I have to be careful here because it's not something I've explained to my family, but they won't be watching this.
But I'm pushing you to this public obligation to visit Ukraine by saying it on the video recording.
Video. Well, there's two opportunities. One is to set up an event similar to the one that we did last year. Last year it was in August. I think because of the various sort of timelines and so on, it's likely that it will be in September this time. But that is one thing. Definitely, we're going to set up another event. Anna is going to help me with some of the logistics there. So, and that likely will be in Lviv again because we've got the venue, we've got the camera crew, we know how much it all costs and what all the logistics are like. So that's a known entity, and we also know there's some fantastic speakers who are prepared to come across the country, but there's also lots of fantastic people in the Lviv area who are a ready source of guests for such an event. But as a few people on my channel will have heard, some of the interviews, including the marvelous conversations with you, are going to be turned into a book later in the year. When I finally get around to writing that. But that is slated to be published in October. And I'm very much hoping that with the support of the publisher, we'd be doing a tour of Ukraine, and that would encompass multiple cities. And what we do is have guests at each event, guest speakers, and we'd film it and put that on the channel as well. So those are the two plans, and let's see. I'm also hoping to make the transition to doing this kind of activism and sort of videos on geopolitics full time sometime during the course of the year. And that would potentially, free up my time to come across, more frequently.
This is great news, and I'm looking forward to this visits and also the reasons for this visits, like your book being published. And there are no words that can describe my Ukrainian gratitude to you personally, to your motivation, your understanding of our life, and the desire to be here with us during this very challenging times. And to your people. When I've named my channel Anna from Ukraine, I felt it's kind of very simple. I did not plan to become a YouTuber. It was just like an impulse and momentum. But then when I was reading comments, and still when I'm reading them, I often come across this words like Eric from Norway, Lucy from Australia, and it is an extremely vivid description of you, one of the most important identities of the person, and it returns us back to this medieval times when people were really closely connected to the land. So I want to thank all people from the United Kingdom for their continued support, this really close relations that we feel. And one of the greatest things that I personally experience is that I don't need to persuade you. That you need to stand with Ukraine. I don't need to provide you arguments. I don't need to show you cases. Somehow you know it. And that's like family, your mother loves you and understands you despite all the circumstances. So we do feel this close connection, and we are very grateful, a part of the military aid, political decisions, strong voices. We are grateful for this understanding without the need to explain, because sometimes when you're very tired surviving, you may not find the best phrases or the best illustrations, but you know that. So thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you so much, Silicon Curtain, which is a beautiful community. And I once again remind you to subscribe if you're not yet subscribed, because there are many things that I learned from your channel. Also get inspiration, some optimism. So thank you for doing that. Looking forward for your book, and maybe some final greetings to my viewers, whom I'm sure we share.
Definitely. Thank you so much. It's a great privilege to be able to share these thoughts with your audience. I hope they're, not too boring, me rambling on about stuff. But no, it's also fantastic to share the kind of purposefulness that Ukrainians have, to share the sense of sort of values and the willingness to fight so hard for them. I think that that gives everyone who sort of follows and supports Ukraine meaning in their lives as well. And I think that's incredibly important, that we can find that sort of common ground and common purpose.
Thank you once again, Jonathan. Thank you, Silicon Curtain. Remember, you have millions of friends in Ukraine, and we're always happy to meet with you online and offline. And our traditional phrase, now we will test you. Slava Ukraini!
Дякую, слава Україні. Героям слава.
Everything is correct.